everyone. Welcome to Resistance Live for the 20th of February, 2025. It's been a month since Donald Trump took office. A month. And I woke up this morning thinking about just how much damage and destruction has been done in that time, not to mention all the damage and destruction that we've seen in the last 24 hours. So we have a lot to talk about this morning, not the least of which is Trump's declaration of himself as a king, which is in and of itself really weird and emblematic of some other issues. But we're going to talk about that along with some key developments related to layoffs from the federal government. Interesting times to say the least. Okay, first things first today for our visually challenged viewers, I am wearing a cream turtleneck sweater. My hair is down. I'm a pink skinned, green eyed, dirty blonde haired woman, and I'm in front of my bookshelf and a yellow utility cart and my big cushy chair behind me, where I meditate every morning. I am coming to you, as always, from occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohican land. All right, so let's talk about this crazy thing that happened on Truth Social yesterday. And I want everybody to understand the background on it, which is really big for everybody in the New York City metro area like I am. Okay, let me just explain what's been happening. There's been a big debate in the greater New York City area about this thing called congestion pricing. And essentially what congestion pricing was designed to do was lower traffic below 60th Street in Manhattan by raising the price of the tolls that it costs to enter Manhattan in a car. And I think it's brilliant. Every New Yorker that I know thinks it's brilliant. When it was put into place by Governor Kathy Hochul, it had an instant reduction in traffic inside Manhattan and also a drastic improvement in air quality. The money that is being raised goes directly to the MTA, which is the agency that runs the New York City subway and bus system. And since the congestion pricing was put into place, subway crime is down by like more than 30%. So congestion pricing has been a huge success. There's like really kind of no debate about this, except for the governor of New Jersey, who has taken on this issue as like some kind of campaign strategy. But all the New Jerseyites that I know love it, because one of the things that it's meant is that there's additional funding for mass transportation, which most people in New Jersey use anyway. And, you know, it's only during rush hour. So you're not paying that money if you're going in on the weekend. You're not paying that money if you're going in, let's just say, you know, like on a Saturday to check out the National History Museum. It's really not a bad thing at all. Okay. Because it benefits people, benefits the environment, benefits traffic, benefits New Yorkers, and Donald Trump's got a chip on his shoulder. Yesterday, he sent a notice to Kathy Hochul that he was ending congestion pricing. Now, he's not legally allowed to do that. And it was literally within an hour that a lawsuit was filed by the MTA against the Trump administration for this effort, seeking a declaratory judgment that the funding that was at stake belongs to the MTA. Okay, so we're going to see how that one plays out in court. Kathy Hochul gave a really big press conference yesterday about this, saying she was like ready to go to war, more or less, over congestion pricing, which is shocking because, by the way, I'll just tell you, she really had to be pushed to put it into place. And all of a sudden, Kathy Hochul, who was not really very well loved by most New Yorkers, is now, after yesterday, something of a heroine in the way in which she's being perceived by people in the greater New York City metro area. Okay, so all that set aside, when Trump did this, he put a post up on Truth Social with a fake magazine cover, like AI-generated magazine cover that said Trump across the top of him in a crown, and a statement right below that that said, "Long live the king." And he said something on the post itself that was like, "I've just ended congestion pricing for New Yorkers. Long live the king." Something along those lines, okay? And there was like immediate outrage about this from a variety of corners. And then there was like Dan Goldman, who happens to be a representative in New York, who said, we should all ignore this. This is just like, you know, a shiny object, which like literally everyone disagreed with, including, you know, George Conway, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You know, anybody who has been paying attention understands that this is just the manifestation of Trump's sociopathic narcissism. Because when you put this together with the statement that he made a few days ago about how no one who saves their country violates the law, what you're seeing is that he actually perceives himself now as a king and wants to be perceived in that way. So this is the latest and perhaps the most obvious ever manifestation of the way in which he wants others to see him. And for that reason, it's very disturbing because, like, we overthrew a king in order for America to be America and to be a democracy and, you know, to have separate branches of government. So the thing that this made me do this morning was go running off to my, you know, like old studies on the French Revolution. So for those who don't know, maybe you haven't been here for a while, I had a triple major in college. One was in creative writing, one was in professional writing, which is essentially journalism. And the third major I had was in French. And that required a lot of study of French history. And I actually lived in France for almost a year during the time that I was in college, in a town kind of like south of Paris. And, I learned an awful lot there because I was taking courses that were affiliated with the local university at that time about the French Revolution and French history and other things. And so what many people may not know, if you're not really like a student of the French Revolution, is that Louis XIV, right before the French Revolution, declared himself to be the state. L'état, c'est moi was the famous statement. The state is me. I'm the state. And it's very similar to the statement that Trump has made here, right? Because essentially when you put these two things together, he's declaring that he is essentially the law. He is the ruler. He is the one who decides. We talked about that crazy EO yesterday that he signed that said that he's the only person, along with Pam Bondi, who is allowed to say what the law is. Okay, so all of this, yes, is a signal of the consolidation of power. No question about it. Now, does it mean that he's actually a king? Well, not quite. That's the good news. One of the things, by the way, when you go back and you look at the French Revolution, that's really fascinating is that there are all these philosophers from the Enlightenment right before the French Revolution who opined on what democratic government really looks like. And one of them, I'm going to forget what his last name is now. I think it's the Baron de Montserrat. I could be wrong about that. Wrote about the fact that when you have, and I quoted this on Blue Sky this morning, when you have the legislature and the executive combined in one person or in one body of rulers, there can be no liberty. Because if there isn't a check and balance against the executive, there's no freedom, right? And so just even looking back on all that kind of stuff, it's very apparent what the consequences are to our democracy if, in fact, he's the one who decides the law, he's the one who rules as the executive. That essentially means that there are no checks on his power, okay? Fortunately, we're not there yet. Now, I want to make something really clear because there was a question on the Patreon feed this morning. Again, reminder, you want to ask me questions for the broadcast for 3 hours beforehand and have me answer them in writing or on the air. You can become a paid subscriber over at patreon.com/resistancelive for as little as $5 a month. That's like 20 cents a broadcast. So it's very well worth it. Someone over on the Patreon feed this morning asked a question about presidential immunity and what happened in that court decision last year and how that relates to this kind of stuff. So let me just make something really clear, okay? There's a lot of misinformation out there about what that opinion actually says. What that opinion says is that things that are taken in the course of his presidential duties, he is immune from prosecution for while he is in office, okay? Not forever, while he is in office, all right? And one of the things that that doesn't say is that if he's acting outside the scope of his official presidential duties, he's immune. It doesn't say that. Okay, so if he's taking actions that are outside the scope of his constitutional authority, he can still be prosecuted for those. Now, we have an issue because the sitting president can't be prosecuted under DOJ policy, but it doesn't mean that he can't be prosecuted forever. And it doesn't mean that actions that he takes that are outside the scope are immune from prosecution. So the thing that's important about that decision is nuance, right? But it relates to the primary topic of today in the following way. If he is acting as a king rather than as an executive under our system of government, and he does things outside the scope of that are criminal, he can be prosecuted when he leaves office. So I don't want anybody to think, and I know there's going to be some naysayers who are like, but he's never leaving office, right? None of that is, we'll see what happens. We don't know what the outcome of this is going to be. Like, we literally don't know what's going to happen next week. So we'll save that conversation for another day, but let me just say this, okay? He is not a king yet, and hopefully will never be, all right? And the fact that he's declaring himself a king doesn't make it so. This is the other thing I have to remind everybody of, particularly those of you who maybe aren't watching every day. We talked last week about the fact that, actually earlier this week, about the fact that, just because he says that he's the law, that he decides what the law is. Talked about this just yesterday, but time is long in the Trump 2 era. Just because he says he decides what the law is doesn't make it so, right? He can't create a law by executive order. That's not how our system of government works. And all of this is being tested in the courts right now. We're going to have to see how this outcome works. and, you know, like what the outcome is actually going to be when it comes to this, but he's not a king. Even more important than that, though, is one nuance that I want everybody to kind of like think about, okay? Elon Musk is not a king. And Elon Musk doesn't have the benefit of presidential immunity. Now, you may wonder who's going to prosecute him, because if he's breaking federal law, that would fall to the DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's offices. Who's really going to go after him? That's a really good question. But there's nothing that says that Elon Musk can't be prosecuted. And so if he's violating the law, which he appears to be 6 ways to Sunday right now, more on that in a minute, he actually can be prosecuted like tomorrow if a legitimate indictment is sought by prosecutors. So everybody's got to kind of like take a breath on this, because I know there was a lot of panic about this. But the lesson to be taken from this is actually this. That's what his sociopathic narcissism wants. That's how he wants to be perceived. That doesn't make it reality. And I think, as we all know, even in these moments that are terribly scary, while our government appears to be disintegrating and many of us are worried about losing social services and the impact of it to our family and our friends and people we know who work for the government, the thing to remember here is this, okay? He is not, for the better way of putting it, like a king. And there are limitations and pushback that are happening at every moment right now, especially through the courts and also in the streets and also through everyday people calling their congresspeople and their senators and pushing back. Speaking of which, I do want to mention one other thing here. If you missed Rachel Maddow's A Block last night, I strongly suggest you go and watch it because it was fascinating. And I entered it with like a bit of a cynical mindset myself, which you all know I'm kind of not prone to, but I definitely had a moment where I saw where she was going, where I was like, oh, come on. But she kind of convinced me in the end. And the whole A Block was about the fact that there are Republicans on the Hill who are actually not cable news regulars, maybe not people whose names you would even recognize, okay, who are starting to find a backbone when it comes to pushing back against Trump. And what's fascinating about this is that it has to do not only with like their own moral perspectives about things like Vladimir Putin and what's happening in Ukraine, but also about what matters to their constituents, what their legacy plans have been, like what do they want to be remembered for that's now being destroyed by, let's just say hypothetically, RFK Jr. being the head of HHS, and what could be leveraged there. Because the thing to remember that's so interesting about this, notwithstanding all of our complaints about the Democrats, is that it honestly will not take very much inside the GOP on the Hill to stop all of this dead in its tracks. And she was suggesting that perhaps there's a point of leverage there that can be used. So if you haven't seen it, go back and watch it. Like, go watch it. Because I will just tell you, it kind of got me thinking about strategy on a couple of things. And particularly if the senators and the representatives that she discussed last night happen to be yours, I would strongly suggest calling them. Rachel made that suggestion last night as well, which I've never seen her do. And she's clearly thinking about how to use her platform for a positive purpose right now. So go check it out. All right. Okay. I have to put my glasses on. We had some breaking news right before I came on the air, which is that Mitch McConnell is retiring. And this in and of itself is a transformative moment. One of the things that I just want people to be aware of, though, is that there's no way that we would be where we are if it were not for Mitch McConnell. And I know even he has had enough. I know he's been voting against every single one of Trump's nominees. And yet, I have no empathy, for lack of a better way of putting it. You know, had Merrick Garland actually been confirmed to the Supreme Court when Obama nominated him, we would be an entirely different country. And so it was Mitch McConnell who made that happen. And I can't say I'm bothered by him wandering off into retirement, so to speak. Okay, we have to talk about what happened in the Ninth Circuit yesterday, because there was actually a really good ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers California, Oregon, Washington State, and Idaho. So it's like, you know, the West Coast basically, and up into the Pacific Northwest. What the Ninth Circuit did was evaluate a temporary restraining order that stopped Trump's birthright citizenship, EO. And the Ninth Circuit ruled on a panel. I have to remind you all, okay, when you go to an appellate court in the federal system, you draw a random panel of 3 judges, okay? There's always many, many more than that, usually somewhere in the teens, okay? But you draw a random panel of 3 judges. This was a panel of 3 judges that had 2 judges nominated by Republicans and 1 nominated by a Democrat. And they upheld the TRO to stop Trump's birthright citizenship executive order. This is very good development. And the reason that they did it, now the Ninth Circuit is known for being liberal, so don't get me wrong, but I look at the panel and I'm like, okay, there are Republican judges, majority Republican judges on this panel that ruled that the birthright citizenship EO is toast, okay? I look at this and I think, we talked about this when this EO came out, about the fact that it's written into the Constitution that if you're born in America, you're a citizen. Like, this is cut and dried constitutional law. Doesn't matter whether you're like an originalist or you're somebody who kind of like thinks the Constitution should grow and develop over time. It's in the Constitution, like right there on his face. Okay. Now, there's no question this is going to be appealed to the Supreme Court, and we'll have to see whether or not they take it. They may not. And I will just say that if they deny certiorari on this, they can do it for a number of reasons. One could be because it's a TRO and it's not ripe for them yet. There is still a briefing schedule on the merits of this, because what this was about was an emergency stay of the TRO. There's still a briefing schedule on the merits of this before the Ninth Circuit, scheduled for June, but they will likely try to appeal it to the Supreme Court in advance of that. All right. If the Supreme Court says no, we'll know the reason why they say no, presumably, especially if like they do it in a per curiam opinion, but we'll see. And if they take it, that's going to be a really interesting moment to see how the court splits. And it will certainly be a predictor of what's happening inside the court right now when it comes to Trump. It will also be the second case, if it's accepted, that will be before the Supreme Court on issues related to Donald Trump. The first one, of course, as we've talked about all week this week, has to do with the termination of the head of the Office of Special Counsel inside the DOJ, the guy who was in charge of all the inspectors general, who is Hampton Dillinger. His termination and whether or not it was lawful, which it wasn't because it violated a federal statute, is currently pending before the Supreme Court right now. And briefing schedule on that is very, very short. So we're going to have an inkling before too long about exactly how this could play out in front of SCOTUS. But I'm very pleased with what happened in the Ninth Circuit yesterday. And I think everybody should be. Like, majority Republican panel ruling in favor of the Constitution. Who would have thunk? So that's really good. Okay. Yesterday, we also had an Eric Adams hearing on his dismissal before Judge Dale Ho in the Southern District of New York, friend of a friend. And this was a very interesting hearing because you had the prosecution represented by Emile Beauvais. None of the other DOJ lawyers, you all remember 8 DOJ lawyers quit over this, were present inside the courtroom except Emile Beauvais and his putative boss, who is the guy who represented Trump like as lead defense counsel, Todd Blanche, in Trump's prosecution in New York City. Okay, so it was just Emile Beauvais and Todd Blanche who were the defense team along with one other person. And Emile Beauvais got up and said, the charges have to be dismissed because Eric Adams can't do his job. I'm sorry. Oh my God, you guys, when you see this through the lens of like, years and years and years of being a lawyer in federal court, let alone a lawyer in New York City, who's been in and out of the courtroom like 1,000 times. And you also look at it through the lens of like all the legal training that you have about how like nobody's above the law and like corruption can be prosecuted. And, like we indict elected officials for violating the law, whether or not it impacts their ability to do their job. I was watching this go by in live time. And I was like, this has got to be the most stupid argument I have ever seen for the dismissal of charges against someone ever. And I used to sit in courtrooms in that very courthouse, actually, and watch the criminal docket go ahead of like the civil cases that I was arguing. And I saw some crazy stuff like tried. Okay. Nothing this ridiculous. And literally like Judge Ho was asking about like the ridiculousness of this. So are you saying that like if an elected official in a border state had some relationship to immigration policy and that person committed crimes, they couldn't be prosecuted? Basically, yes, says Emile Beauvais. Anybody kind of like touching any form of Donald Trump's immigration policy can't do their job if they're under indictment. Now, the problem that Judge Ho is facing is that there has literally never been a case in federal court where the prosecution and the defense agreed to a dismissal and that the dismissal was denied and that was upheld by the appellate court. Okay, like every judge who's ever tried it has been overturned. There's no precedent for that. And of course, you have to ask yourself, what's Judge Ho going to do? Force the DOJ to try Eric Adams when this DOJ is so plainly corrupt and that like 8 people quit so they wouldn't have to file this exact motion? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. And Judge Ho did not decide yesterday. We're like waiting on a ruling from him at this point to see what he does. But he sounded deeply suspicious. And frankly, if I was Emile Beauvais or anyone like, affiliated with him, I would be deeply embarrassed about the argument that I made. Like, it really kind of dances over a whole slew of ethical lines to make an argument like that. You shouldn't face prosecution for crimes you committed because otherwise you could be out campaigning. That was one argument he made. You shouldn't face prosecution because then you don't have security clearance to deal with Donald Trump's mass deportation plans. That's another argument that he made. Really not cool. Like, I mean, that's like pejorative, but like really not okay, not ethical, right? Not consistent with the law. So we're going to have to see what Judge Ho does with this, but we're patiently awaiting the outcome of this enormous scandal that has essentially gutted the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office. Crazy. Okay. In the interim, we've had a number of announcements over the last 24 hours about cuts that are coming to employees. It is expected that today the IRS is going to lay off 6,700 workers under orders from DOJ. I mean, what could go wrong in the middle of tax season, right? In addition to that, we found out today that there are cuts going into place for the division of HUD that provides emergency services in the event of disasters. What does that mean? That means that if you lose your home due to a flood resulting from a hurricane, good effing luck getting any money or support out of HUD to deal with temporary housing or anything related to it. Okay. So we're seeing the decimation of services that are really like at this point coming very close to home for a lot of people because climate crisis is coming for all of us in one form or another. And what appears to be the case, there was some analysis being written about this last night. What appears to be the case is that they are cutting workers from anything that arguably could be considered left, USAID, right? Health and Human Services, Social Security, right? All these places where they perceive there to be like woke going on. Or they're cutting employees in places where the employees are operating in functions that would enforce things against the super rich, right? Because if the IRS is down 6,700 employees, it's much harder to prosecute tax evaders who are like uber wealthy, right? It essentially will get them off the hook. And that in and of itself is just profoundly disturbing, not to mention we're in the middle of tax season, right? So we'll have to see what happens with that. But, the overarching numbers right now, and I went and looked at this. Oh, I should say one other thing. 10% of the people who are being laid off at the IRS are veterans. I mean, just impossible to kind of like quantify the harm that this is going to do to local economies, the harm this is going to do nationwide. It's like terrible. So I went and looked at it this morning, and right now, the estimates are that there are going to be 200,000 plus layoffs of government employees as a result of the actions that DOJ is taking. Probationary workers are the biggest group of that. But I have to remind you, probationary workers are not new hires only. There are also people who are waiting for promotions. And so there are some very senior people who are swept up in this idea of probationary workers who are getting laid off and losing their jobs after like decades of employment. And I don't know how we get those people back. This is really kind of like a wholesale gutting of the federal government. And as I said yesterday, this is going to have a huge impact in local markets because reminder, the federal government doesn't just operate in Washington, D.C. It operates around the country. And I talked to two of my really good friends from law school yesterday in Washington, D.C. because I was really curious about how they were holding up. And, the message out of all of this is that everybody's terrified, right? Because they don't know who's going to be next, because everybody knows somebody who's employed by the federal government or who's federal government adjacent. There's a lot of like worry about what it's going to mean for the region. And that's leaving aside what it means for like democracy. And then you add into that, and Rachel covered this yesterday too. I covered it yesterday on the broadcast yesterday morning. This issue of how local economies are dependent on government workers, right? Like Kansas City saying yesterday that they don't have enough open jobs to absorb the people who've been laid off from the Kansas City part of the federal government. Michigan is facing this down too. Minneapolis, Wisconsin, right? Like we have, all sorts of places where there's direct impact as a result of these layoffs, and it's going to cause just tremendous problems, right? So I want to say one thing about this really quick, because there was a lot of discussion on the feed this morning about Social Security again. And, right now, at least anecdotally, and this is only anecdotally, people are getting their checks and things still appear to be moving smoothly. Whether or not our data, Social Security Administration, survivor benefits, all that stuff is in the hands of nefarious actors, kind of looks like it. But for now, payments are continuing to issue, at least from what I'm hearing anecdotally. The thing that I'm the more concerned about right now is the issue of like the impact of all of this to the economy. Because 200,000 jobs, right? Like when we have a really good jobs report, it's like 200,000 jobs have been added to the US economy. That would be a huge announcement. It was a huge announcement during the Biden administration when it happened. Okay. This loss is like not small. And the things that it's going to mean in conjunction with the services that are going to be cut as a result could be really, really significant. Right. And I'm going to add to that then there's this crazy thing happening inside the Department of Defense where Pete Hegseth has announced that he's instituting massive budget cuts. And I have questions about what that means for purposes of like national security. I don't think any of us know yet. So all of these things as they're unfolding raise very serious concerns. And you guys know I don't like to come on here and scare people, but I'm a little worried about where we're going to be economically like a year from now. Maybe even by the summer, I'm really not sure. And I think a lot of us are kind of trying to game out where all of this is going to land, right? The one thing that I will say is that there is some significant polling in the last 24 hours. This was fun, where pollsters, and this is like one of the more reliable pollsters, asked a sample size of US citizens which agency they thought should be eliminated from the federal government. And the highest number at 25% was Doge. So the thing that's kind of wild about this is that what Doge is doing is wildly unpopular, right? Musk's approval ratings, quote unquote, are not good. The actions that are being taken by Doge are opposed by like the vast majority of Americans. And so as this starts to hit home, as people start to like really feel it in their own communities, in their own families, among their friends, we're going to have to see how that changes people's perceptions and their viewpoint and their willingness to get in the streets, right? So we have a long way to go on that. But I just want you all to know that, the cuts are significant and scary. And I'm not trying to panic anybody. I'm just like looking at the long view of this. Okay. Final note for today. Kash Patel is coming up for a vote today. Susan Collins announced that she's voting against him. It's very questionable right now whether or not he's actually going to make it past the whole Senate. If he does, it sounds like it's going to be a tie that J.D. Vance will have to break. But we'll see whether or not there's anybody else who's willing to stand up and vote against him at this point. Please call your senators, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, and tell them that you do not want a crazy insurrectionist at the helm of the FBI. You can put it in other words, but like, please call your senators like ASAP, because they were having a cloture vote while I was going on the air. And so he is going to get a vote at some point today. And it's very, very important to make your voice heard about this because he's got that enemies list. And we know what he's going to do with it if he's put in charge of the FBI. Not to mention that he will gut the FBI because he's had a lot of prior statements about what he thought the FBI was good for. And also, it appears that he committed perjury at least once and perhaps multiple times in his confirmation hearing. So, there's a whole bunch of reasons to reject him. So please call your senators and make your voice heard on that. Also, Linda McMahon, who is accused currently of sex trafficking in conjunction with her ex-husband, has made it out of committee as the head of the Department of Education. Her floor vote has been delayed thanks to Democrats' tactics. But she will be coming up for a vote at some point, probably next week. So I would encourage you to make your calls right now. Please make your calls. Do not neglect your calls to the Senate. Okay. All right. That's it for today, everybody. I'll be back tomorrow at regular time. There will be a progressive coffee hour this weekend for our Patreon subscribers. If you want to join us on that, it's usually on Sunday afternoons, but you have to be a paid subscriber to do it. So head on over there. And please remember that, your comments below this, if you're watching on the replay, help to tell the algorithm that you like what we're doing here. Please give this a thumbs up. Drop me a comment. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet already. And I'm here 5 days a week, as you all know. All right, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. I will see you tomorrow at regular time. And hang in there, everybody. I know these aren't the easiest times, but we're going to get through it together. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.